Okay, so we have a new episode of Legends and Leaders, and today it's great to have Adam here. Adam, you're the CEO of Crowds on Demand, which is a pretty interesting company. Has a very unique niche that you guys help staff crowds for PR stunts, for other types of things that people want to raise awareness for. You put together the groups, you help kind of craft the narrative around what these stunts are. You want to accomplish, and you've been behind a bunch of really influential, more public events and things that have and helped influence major opinion around pretty important topics in today's world, whether that's from a business standpoint, political standpoint, otherwise. So I'm excited to have you here and to get into your story.
Ben, it's such a pleasure to be on your program. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So just going back to the beginning, how did your interest in the world of like being involved in kind of media and then it kind of shifting towards more of putting together protests and putting together kind of staffing and building this type of business, like how did that passion begin?
Well, I started my company in college and I'd worked a whole lot of jobs in college, but most notably, I worked a job as a reporter for AOL News. And I also worked many jobs on the campaign side of things, political campaigns, everything from national to local to statewide races. I consider myself a moderate now, an independent, but everything I worked at that time was on the Democrat side. And I'd always been fascinated with politics and fascinated by how people could and the world of media and how those overlap. And where I got the idea to start this business was when I was in college working on these campaigns. All the people managing the campaigns at the time, this was 2010, were products of the 1960s. These were hardcore activists who could so easily turn out thousands of people. So my job was being the student coordinator for a lot of these political campaigns, and they would say, Adam, bring me 1,000 students, bring me 5,000 students to this event. And I said, that's difficult. I don't think you guys realize how hard it is to do. Because they came of age in a time where you could bring out some pizza and this could be done. So we rarely brought out those kinds of numbers. But even when we brought out 1,000 people or a couple hundred people, there was a huge market difference. And even more so when you were able to bring demonstrators to the other side's rally, you can change the whole narrative of a rally. Instead of candidate X hosts rally, it's protesters picket candidate X's rally. So you've already shaped the narrative. 10 people can shape a narrative about 1,000-person event, and so on and so forth. So I realized I was bringing hundreds of thousands, millions perhaps, in earned media. And to your listeners, what earned media is basically how much it would cost to buy that level of media if it was you were purchasing ads. I was getting millions in earned media and getting paid either very little, basically scraps from the table. So I said, hey, I was in LA at the time. I went to UCLA and I was like, okay, well, you have a ton of people in LA. You have flex workers. They're out of work actors, right? A lot of people are working as waiters, as valets. Could I put them to work doing this type of event and showing up and being passionate supporters or passionate demonstrators, right? So that's exactly what I did. We started in LA, and of course, over the years, we expanded nationwide and even some international, but that's kind of how it all began.
Yeah, it's an incredible company. I mean, I haven't heard of anything really like what you're doing. So how did you actually start to make this into a business? Like you had to recruit people that would be willing to not even volunteer, but to be paid for their time, and then also find people that were actually willing to do that. And how did you kind of even convince those types of businesses or groups that that this was the right way to help get more results for their cause?
Sure. Well, and I guess I'll start with the first question, which is how we started recruiting people. Frankly, it wasn't difficult because keep in mind that when I launched the business in 2012, it was still in the aftermath of what they call the Great Recession, right? So the unemployment rate was very high. So it was not difficult to convince people that, hey, here's a job. You can go out, protest, rally for a few hours. the other thing that we actually used to do is hire off-duty TMZ photographers to be paparazzi, to sort of like lower tier celebrities. So we did all that. It all started in LA and then New York and then expanded from there. So it was a pretty compelling proposition in terms of the team members. In terms of the clientele, one of the major ways we expanded is we actually had a lot of media coverage because it is sort of a unique concept. So we didn't have to go cold call a bunch of customers. They came to us. There's a huge demand, obviously, in the political advocacy space, but also among startup companies. We had a ton of startup companies, and still do, who need to make a splash at large conferences. They need people to know who they are, and they need to do something a little more unconventional to make the case why they're different from the established competitors. So what better way is there to do that than through demonstrations and PR stunts that we do? And because, unlike a lot of ad agencies, we don't have so many conflicts of interest to all these firms that would make it hard for us to do that. So if you're a competitor trying to displace Google in an area, or some of these other companies, right, we don't have conflicts of interest that would have prevented us from taking that on. So we worked a lot for, I guess, the little guy, the upstart. Now we obviously do have medium and larger size clients as well, but I would still say like a lot of our business is working with venture funded startup companies and people who are trying to serve as a catalyst to a movement or to a venture.
Were you surprised, Adam, by the kind of clientele that you wound up getting?
Well, I think that when I launched the company, I had initially focused on the political and advocacy aspect, and that is still a portion of our business. And it's the one that gets the most media coverage. However, I would say the largest part of our business is businesses that are either trying to promote or trying to advocate for themselves in some dispute. So we've worked on a astounding number of patent issues where you've had people whose patents are either being abused, or on the other side, people who feel that they're being trolled by patent trolls, right? And there's been a ton in just some of the most random areas where we've been used that don't get a lot of media coverage, but where our style of advocacy is extraordinarily effective and impactful. So we're used a lot. What surprised me, to answer your question, is how much we're used in the business world, and that is the majority of our business now is business clients, not advocacy clients.
It's pretty fascinating that so many businesses really need this. I mean,
They
I
do.
was,
I always say we tend to be hired by the side that's losing now. Not that we aren't ever hired by the winners, but we're typically hired by the David in the David versus Goliath struggles, right? So we're brought in when someone says we need to disrupt, we need to be unconventional, and our strategies are unconventional. We protest people's office, we put blimps out, we hire planes with skywriters, we hire billboard trucks, we make phone calls. I had a campaign where I was literally calling someone's rabbi asking him to do something, because I was looking for any avenue to try to convince this guy, right? And I was like, I found out who his rabbi was, and we started calling the rabbi. So our techniques are very unconventional. So it's not that we are never hired by the entrenched interest, but sometimes the entrenched interest is more wary of an unconventional approach, whereas the David needs an unconventional approach because the default is they lose.
yeah, definitely interesting. So, Adam, what goes into actually like successfully doing a counter protest or just raising awareness for a brand? Like, how do you actually get these people, to work well together and come up with like a strategy for it to be successful?
Well, it's always a combination of what the client's vision is and what our ideas are. So in some cases, the client will come to us with they know everything. They know exactly what we want to do. They've already thought of sort of a clever idea, and they just essentially need us to provide the execution for it. And in other cases, I would say a majority of cases, it's a collaboration where we'll identify. One of my strong suits is try to identify, whether it's an advocacy or a business, is who has the power to help you get what you want. That's the number one thing in the business world that I think a lot of people are not strategic about, is if you're looking to get something done, who is empowered to get that done? So if you're trying to persuade a company, who at that company do you need to reach? Is it the board members, right? Is it the senior executives? Is it their top shareholders, right? So you want to identify who matters, right? So if, for example, I'm trying to persuade McDonald's of something, it's not going to do that much good to stage a protest outside of a couple branches of McDonald's. This is a multi-billion-dollar business. They're not going to care. So you have to look at what the CEO of McDonald's and the board of directors of McDonald's care about. So to the extent that the clients want to involve me in the planning process, I always try to focus on who are you trying to convince, make a list of those names or those companies or those institutions, and make sure that we're laser focused, because that's going to save you time and money, right? So that's number one. Number two is when it actually comes to the events, to identifying, well, what are the best ways? Is it phone calls? Should we do 100 phone calls a day, 1,000 phone calls, 10,000, right? Is it deploying protesters? How many protesters is going to work? If it's a car dealership, maybe 10 protesters does the trick. If you're trying to get Congress to pass a bill, 10 isn't going to do the trick. You're going to need to have a ton of protesters, and you're going to need to have them across different locations and probably sustain that for a substantial period of time. So depending on your objectives, you have to determine what scale is appropriate. And in some cases, that's involves managing client expectations as to what the budget is going to be. For example, you'd be surprised how many calls I get where somebody's like, well, we want Congress to pass a bill, and we think we can do it with a 50-person march one time. I'm like, have you watched the Schoolhouse Rock video? Do you have any idea how this works? Right. So part of it is setting the expectations there, right? And then it actually comes, once we're kind of set on the expectations, it comes to the execution part of it and determining, okay, we have to sort of, I hesitate to use the word cast the events, but to determine who is the best fit for the event. So in terms of a corporate PR stunt, we do sort of call it casting. So we had one of my favorite events was the cryptocurrency industry. Some large crypto players hired us to do this series of events called Bankers Against Bitcoin. It got to the top of Reddit for like a week in running because it was just hilarious. We had a bunch of old white guys in kind of old suits pretending to be bankers protesting Bitcoin, right? And kind of the idea was that, and this was right outside of a cryptocurrency conference, this was to kind of actually shine a light on how out of touch the banks were with the new world of cryptocurrencies, right? So part of it was, hey, we have to cast the right people. We want characters, right? We don't want just a bunch of older white guys. We want people to have really good videos so that they can kind of make this like a hilarious montage of things, right? When it comes to like a hardcore advocacy event, like let's just say we're trying to block a power plant being built, well, then maybe it's an environmentalist, right? We have to make sure that these are environmentalists and that they care about the issue, and we liaise with local environmental groups and we compensate them for protesting somebody as something that they already dislike. We're just essentially giving them the funding to do that, because especially in this economy with kind of low unemployment, but also high cost of living, people don't just have time to take a week off and protest, right? It's like you need to be compensated for your time.
So, Adam, when you get approached by a company or by a group that wants to do some sort of, protest, how do you handle it if, let's just say, it doesn't align with the values that you have personally? Because sometimes you're protesting and these result in major changes that may
Sure.
not align with the values you have.
Well, that's a complex process. We definitely have a strong policy that we don't work with hate groups, right? And also with foreign entities absent appropriate disclosures, right? We are, you might be surprised or perhaps not surprised that we regularly get contacted by kind of suspicious folks from abroad who we think have bad intents, who are trying to corrupt American democracy, right? And you might have read in the news about how Iran and Russia and China and other players are kind of meddling, and we don't want any part of that. So to the extent that we determine that we think your intents are nefarious to our country, we're very patriotic. We don't want to do anything like that. And then the third thing, so no hate, no hostile foreign actors, and also, frankly, we try to take on campaigns that we think we'll win on, right? And win is obviously subjective, but we'll get the client somewhat of what they're looking for, or at least give it a shot. In some cases, we tell the client, hey, we think it has a 20% chance of succeeding, and that's acceptable, right? In the venture capital world, 20% can be great, right? So part of it is sort of setting client expectations in that regard.
Yeah, that's interesting. What were what would you say are some of your favorite stories of maybe protests you've organized or campaigns you put together that worked out in ways that were unexpected?
Well, another one of my favorite campaigns, which really does align so closely with my values, is we were hired, and I can't exactly say who, but brought us in to do it was called hashtag delete Facebook. And this was during 2018 when everything has come up with the Cambridge Analytica scandal and how Facebook, I call it Facebook, even though they try to call themselves Meta. I call them Facebook. They can't run from what they did, right? In regards to, their role in the genocide in Myanmar, right, in Burma, in regards to their perversion of the American political system and their violation of privacy rules. So we staged this huge campaign, multi-city. It went viral, of Delete Facebook, where it was basically raising awareness about these concerns and about Facebook and its kind of cavalier attitude. And I hope that we actually were part of pushing Facebook long term to kind of stay hands off politics, because what they've made a kind of concerted effort over the last couple of years to say, let's become less political. As platforms like Twitter lean really heavily into politics, they're becoming less political, which I see as a good thing, because frankly, when they were political, they were really used for a lot of bad purposes. So that was just such an impactful effort that I was really happy to do.
And what do you think led to that being so successful? I mean, the delete Facebook piece of it is something that's simple, it can be catchy, but what did you specifically do that you think helped blow that up?
I think it's partially it's just the zeitgeist, right? When you tap into the zeitgeist, and there's intense frustration with what happened, whether you're on the left wing or the right wing. You look at the fact that Facebook essentially allegedly kind of sold user data for money, and was kind of didn't really care about its users and allowed them to be manipulated, right? That resonated because people saw themselves in that, right? Whether you're conservative or liberal, when you went on Facebook, you would see yourself being manipulated, and you would see yourself being fed doom scrolling clickbait that would really just sort of get you into the depths of disagreement, and broke up families, unfortunately, right? Literally, families were broken up by some of the algorithmic changes that radicalize people on all sides, right? So I think that people saw themselves in what had happened. and that was impactful.
Adam, where do you see your space going now? Like this ability, this industry of or kind of crowdsourcing, organizing protests, organizing like PR stunts. Where do you kind of see this space going next?
Well, as we've gotten older as a business, I've become more selective about who we take on as customers. As you can imagine, when you begin a business, you're basically typically stuck taking on whoever is willing to pay you. At this point, we are lucky to have a lot of people wanting us to get involved in different things. So I want to take on more projects to play to my passions. And my long-term goal, personal goal, is to take on fewer clients at a time. I mean, we have often dozens plus of customers at a time. I'd like to just split my time between 3 or 4 big projects, or maybe even 2 big projects that really play to my passions and where the client is willing to kind of invest the resources to taking it to the next level. That's my long-term goal. It has happened, albeit slower than I had hoped. Just slowly and slowly, because you have times where that happens, and then times where those customers move on, and then you kind of take on more. But my focus is really to have a few passion projects where the budget is such that they're really able to take it to a level of succeeding and being world changing in a positive manner. And conversely, that has meant one of the things we've said no to was getting involved in some of this Israel-Palestine matter. We've gotten a ton of offers, 6-figure, 7-figure deals plus, to get involved on all kind of sides of that matter. And it's not that I oppose even getting involved. It's more that I don't see a way to be constructive in that space. If we got an offer that was constructive, where I felt that we'd actually make things better and not just add to the noise, then I'd be very excited to take those on. But all the offers thus far, I think, are just more adding to the noise, and I don't see them actually remedying the broader problem.
Yeah, it's good that you're able to be selective and much more selective now, because I think there's probably, like you mentioned before, actors in this space that don't have the best intentions, and maybe when you're earlier on, it may be harder to realize that, and you could be assisting them in some ways. But now, I mean, you get
You
to
don't always
filter
know
them
that.
out.
Yeah, when you're just starting a business, you don't always know that in regards to your customers. You don't always know what their intentions are. But having been in this business for 12 years, I have a better sense. Again, I'm always I try to think of myself as a lifelong learner, so I want to keep learning and keep growing. Even as I've been in this job for 12 years, it's a very, very different job than it was 12 years ago.
Definitely. Just the last question that I have, Adam. If you had to like say some of your goals, you have short-term goals, long-term goals, and your big picture vision as well at this point, what would you say that is?
Well, in terms of short-term and long-term goals, short-term goals, as I said, it's to focus on more on passion projects, and to uh, develop things such that that we can actually focus on 3 or 4 clients and devote our sole attention to them, as opposed to dozens of clients. I think that is that is a that is a goal, but part of it is identifying those who align on vision and resources, um, and um, making really a show in the world. And the 2 long-term goals, my priorities, are really holding accountable a lot of bad actors in the food and health space. If you look at processed foods, there's just so much out there these days about how much they are killing people. And I listened to your piece with the head of Crunch Fitness, and he was mentioning some of that about how Americans are poisoning themselves with their food. And a lot of companies, I'd love to do a campaign that calls out the hypocrisy of certain companies in the food and beverage space that pretend to care about diversity and pretend to care about marginalized communities, and yet they market the worst and least healthy foods to the most marginalized communities. So there's a huge contradiction in values there that I'd like to take on and be part of making America healthy. Um, and the second is a cause that's very passionate. For me, it's the issue of Afghan refugees. I had the good fortune of assisting with certain other folks in the nonprofit world, many Afghan refugees from escaping from Afghanistan as it fell to the Taliban a few years ago, working to get them on the appropriate lists, people who help the United States and who are patriots and love this country. And it's a major passion of mine to make sure there's so many people still left in Afghanistan or in refugee camps in far-flung parts of the world. And some of the people who I personally support here in the United States are on public assistance or unable to get work permits. And to me, these are people who helped America, risked their lives for America, were promised things by our country, and we've failed them under administration after administration. So if I could make a difference for the Afghan refugees and on food quality, that would be huge in terms of the long term.
Well, Adam, that was all the questions that I had. I appreciate you taking the time and doing this. I think you've had a lot of positive impact in many different areas, especially just because of the nature of the business you're in. And I'm sure you're going to continue to do that, whether it's through food and making sure people have healthy food and that's accessible, and that the awareness around what's going on in that category is something that's present in a lot of people's minds, and the other areas you mentioned before. So I look forward to seeing what you're going to do next and wishing you much success.
Absolutely. And to you as well, Ben, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to your listeners.